Now I'd like to turn things over to our friend at Atlanta, Crystal Jackson. He's going to review today's agenda for us.
Thank you, Brandy. Good morning. And on behalf of our ARC team, I want to thank everyone for joining us yesterday and today for the Summit on Sustainability. The programming has been outstanding so far, and I know each of you have takeaways from the general session and breakout sessions. We're excited for the remaining portion of the summit today. Next, we have one more set of breakout sessions from 10:15 to 11:15. So please make your way to www.morpc.org/summitlive to pick which breakout session you would like to attend. And then join us back here for the closing plenary session, where we will announce the recipients of the remaining 2 Regional Sustainability Awards and hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. You're not going to want to miss it. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the summit.
Good morning. I'm Doug Hooker. I'm Executive Director for the Atlanta Regional Commission, otherwise known as the ARC. We certainly hope that you have enjoyed all of the programming from yesterday and today. This conference has been a great work done by the staffs of MORPC and ARC, very thoughtful and challenging, I think, in explaining the progress and the challenges of sustainability in both of our regions. Of course, conferences like this wouldn't be possible without the support of major sponsors. And we have 3 wonderful major sponsors to thank today: Verizon, SWACO, and The Ohio State University. And we really appreciate their support for making this possible. I'm excited for our closing program, in which we will hear Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. But before we turn things over to her, I'm going to pass things over to Karen Angelou, who is the chair of the MORPC Board of Directors and also a city council member with the city of Kahana. And she's going to present the Collaborative Achievement Award. So, council member.
Good morning, and thank you, Doug. We are so excited to have the opportunity to partner with the friends in Atlanta on the conference this year. I am honored today to present the Central Ohio's Collaborative Achievement in Sustainability Award. This award recognizes a group of entities or individuals who have shown effectiveness in producing environmental accomplishments through a collaborative effort with tangible results, innovation, and long-term impacts on Central Ohio. Of all the nominees received, we are excited to announce that the award goes to the Regional Sustainability Dashboard. Congratulations to all the partners who worked on the dashboard. We are excited to announce that the dashboard, are you ready, launches today. So be sure to check it out and see all of the progress Central Ohio is making in sustainability. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Schimmer. I'm the chair of the Sustainability Advisory Committee at MORPC and the director of Franklin County's Economic Development Program. You know, every once in a while, a combination comes along that you never would have imagined. And I'm going to suggest that Buckeyes and Grits have come together in a big way for this conference. We are so pleased, and I personally am honored to present the next award, which is Central Ohio's Leadership in Mobility Award. This is an award that is in memory of Bill Lewis, who was a former chief mobility engineer for the city of Columbus. And Bill is one of those people who stay with you in your mind and you remember him. He was a terrific person, somebody who was a fine engineer and somebody who was never and never will be forgotten by a number of us here in Columbus. He was a person that exemplifies outstanding work that's needed when you're trying to create a world-class multimodal system in Central Ohio. And with that, and all of the nominations that we've received, there's a guy that is going to get this award who understands Bill Lewis's contribution. And this award, the Leadership in Mobility Award, goes to Ted Beidler, Chief Mobility Engineer for the City of Columbus's Engineering Office.
Transportation in Central Ohio simply wouldn't be where it is today without the leadership of Ted Beidler, most recently serving as Chief Mobility Engineer at the Franklin County Engineers Office, where he has led engineers, technicians, and field crews in improving transportation facilities. Ted has capped off a long career filled with many contributions to a more vibrant, sustainable Central Ohio. Key among them are increased mobility options for residents and visitors. Being a cyclist himself, Ted has firsthand experience that has framed his perspective in planning safe and comfortable multimodal transportation facilities. As a collaborator and past chair of the Central Ohio Greenways Trail Development Working Group, he has helped advance the regional trail vision and ensure support of the planning effort across multiple jurisdictions. And thanks to Ted, the design and construction of the region's trails are being completed under guidelines based on both local and national best practices. A friend, a mentor, and a true leader, Ted Beidler has shaped sustainable transportation in Central Ohio for decades to come.
Congratulations, Ted. We can't think of a better way for you to start your retirement. Thanks for all that you've done for our region.
Well, good afternoon, or good morning, everybody. I'm William Murdoch, the Executive Director of the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. You know us as MORPC. We're so pleased to be here and in partnership with our friends at the Atlanta Regional Commission. So proud of our chair, Karen Angelou, and our sustainability chair, Jim Schimmer. They do such amazing work for MORPC and leading us and guiding us. And of course, congratulations to all of our award winners. We're thrilled to have so many sustainability efforts and such outstanding leaders in Central Ohio. At this time, I have the honor of introducing our fantastic, exciting, compelling keynote speaker for this closing session. We're excited to welcome Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters. She comes to us from Texas Tech University, where she's currently the Political Science Endowed Professor in Public Policy and Public Law and co-directs the Climate Center. Dr. Hayhoe is a remarkable communicator. If you've seen her, you know this. She's received the American Geophysical Union Climate Communication Prize, the Stephen Schneider Climate Communication Award, the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award, and to top it off, she's been named to a number of lists, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Thinkers, and Fortune Magazine's World's Greatest Leaders. We are in for a treat. Dr. Hayhoe, we are so excited to have you as part of this year's Sustainability Summit, and we're looking forward to your insightful talk. And without any further ado, here's Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to be able to join you virtually. And we are going to be talking to each other a little bit, as well as you having the chance to ask questions at the end. So let me share my screen with you and we will get started. All right. So something that occupies all of our minds is the weather and the climate. But first of all, I want to ask you a couple of questions. So on your phone, or if you are watching from a computer, which some of you may be doing, go ahead and go to pollev.com/myname, which is Katharine. Make sure to include both A's there or else you'll end up in the wrong place. And this is the way that you are going to be able to ask questions at the end, and you'll be able to upvote the questions of others as well. But for now, I wanted to ask you, who are you? Are you in the public sector? Are you in the nonprofit sector? Are you in education or academia? Are you in the private sector or other? Go ahead and pick A, B, C, or D or E. Okay, it looks like we've got about 2/3 in the public sector, 1/3 in private. Oh, more in the public sector coming in. Okay. Oh, we got nonprofit. All right. It just took a little longer to get your finger there. Okay. And all right. Okay. So now let me ask you a second question. And this is a question that is a little harder to answer. You have to use a word rather than a letter. Okay. The second question is this. What is the most memorable weather event that you have ever lived through? And if you're going to use more than one word, I need you to join that word with a dot. So if you are going to say Hurricane Matthew, I want you to say Hurricane dot Matthew. Or you could just say hurricane. What is the most memorable weather event that you have ever lived through? Oh, we got a Katrina here. Okay. What else? Hurricane Arthur, a lot of hurricanes. Are we sure this is Ohio? All right. We've got California, yep, tornadoes. Blizzards, flooding. Yes, okay. Oh, a derecho, yeah, we get a lot of those. A sandstorm, interesting. More floods. And this is a Wordle, so the more people answer a certain question, the more people the bigger the word, I should say. All right. So weather is something that we all remember. And I live in Texas, and let me tell you, Texas has weather. Texas has ice storms and blizzards. Yeah, it really does. It also has floods and droughts. It has dust storms so big they have their own name, Haboob. This is a picture of a dust storm that actually happened here in Lubbock. And in fact, when the Weather Channel had a competition a number of years ago for the craziest weather, some of the #1 cities in that competition were Texas, because if you look at the number of weather and climate disasters that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage for each state across the US since 1980, you can see that Ohio's up there, but Texas is #1 because it gets every type of disaster. And in fact, when they had that competition of all the cities that entered, the city where I live, Lubbock, Texas, won the toughest weather city competition against Fairbanks, Alaska, Fargo, North Dakota, and Caribou, Maine, which is not a place that I had heard of before, but just from the name, you kind of get the sense that they probably have some pretty tough weather. Now, just to keep everything in perspective, there was another competition that same year. This was 8 years ago, actually. And the other competition they had was for the most boring city in America, and Lubbock also won that. So just a perspective. Weather, though, is something that our brains are built to remember. When I asked you what's the most memorable weather event that you've lived through, you had an answer. Why? Because that's the way our brains work. Our brains are programmed to remember memorable events. So we can remember weather events going far back into our past, probably even our childhood. Weather, though, is like a single tree. It's what happens in a certain place on a certain day or week or even a year. So it's a record-breaking heat wave or a crazy cold year without a summer or a big storm. But climate is the long-term average of weather. Climate is like a forest. It's the average of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. So our brains, and this is important, our brains are not built to remember climate. Can you, let's be honest, can you add up the weather on every single day of the year for not just 1 year, but for 20 to 30 years in your head and fit a trend line to it? No, none of us can do that unless we're abnormally gifted in that department. You can't add up, 10,000 data points in your head and then figure out if they're going up and down. So climate is an inherently non-intuitive concept for us as humans. But climate is what our entire society and civilization is built on. Wherever we live, our day-to-day conditions, we can have hot and cold and wet and dry. But our society is built on the assumption that they all average out over time. In other words, that climate is stable. Specifically, we assume that the long-term average and the highs and the lows that we've seen in the past are an accurate prediction of what we would expect in the future. And this is what we have built our entire society on, is the assumption of a stable climate. Like what? Well, these assumptions are what underlie our building codes, what type of crops we grow where and when and how, the energy demand that we plan for, where we draw our flood zones, whether we have snow removal capacity or not, our water planning, our energy planning, even the clothes we have in our closet are determined by our average climate. And it works really well. It's worked fantastically over the course of human civilization on this planet when climate has been stable, which it has been. We've had short-term regional variations in climate over human history, but at the global scale, our climate has been as stable, our temperature specifically, has been as stable as that of the human body over the course of human civilization. Our human body temperature goes up and down a few tenths of a degree over the course of a day, but it remains pretty stable. And that's exactly what the Earth has done too. So here's the problem though. Planning for the future based on the past is like driving down a road looking in a rear view mirror. It actually works great if the road is straight, right? Now, I'm not recommending that you try it, but if you're driving down a dead straight road, looking in the rear view mirror is a perfect predictor of where you'll be in the future. So when climate is stable, looking only to the past in order to plan for the future is a reliable technique. It works. But what if the long-term average is changing? Now, if the long-term average is changing, if climate is changing, do we still have cold days? Yes. We also have hot days. We have wet, we have dry, we have drought, we have flood. That's weather. But what we see is that the long-term average, as well as the highs and lows that we've seen in the past, they can't accurately predict everything that we're going to see in the future anymore. And this is where we find ourselves today. So what is the solution? The solution is to keep one eye on the rear view mirror, because the past is valuable and it does give us valuable information, but we have to take our other eye and we have to fix it ahead down the road today to ensure that we make it around that curve to ensure a safe future for us all. So when we look at that curve, what is happening? How can we characterize the curve that we are all on, and in fact that our wheels are already on the rumble strip of? We know today that we are seeing long-term trends in climate over 20 to 30 years that are affecting our average temperature, our precipitation, even our sea level. And these are permanently altering the characteristics of many regions. Just to give you an idea, our winters have warmed so much where I live that our plant hardiness zone, which is a USDA designation for what type of plants you can grow where and when and how, our plant hardiness zone today where I live in Northwest Texas is the same as what they had in Central Texas 25 years ago. That is a permanent change that's happened that affects our agriculture, our gardens, and more. But we also see that our extremes are changing. And that is really where our wheels are on the rumble strip. And we are seeing with our own eyes the impact of those changing extremes. Let me show you a few examples. And all of these come from the National Climate Assessment, which I was one of the lead authors on. If you're not familiar with the National Climate Assessment, I recommend take a quick picture or a screenshot of this because it is a great resource. It has one chapter for every region of the US. And it has one chapter for every sector. So transportation, buildings, energy, water, all of those types of things. And what it does is it gives you an overview of what has already happened in that place or in that sector and how climate has already changed and the impacts it has already had. And then it tells you what we see happening in the future and how people are already responding, because we already are responding, we're just not responding fast enough. So this is a fantastic resource if you want more information. But to give you the highlights of it, first of all, in terms of our long-term trends, we see that temperature is increasing, and in some places it's increasing more than others. We see that it's changing faster in winter as compared to summer. And we see that in the future, we expect those changes to get bigger over time, number one. So in the middle, we have the middle of the century, and at the bottom, we have the end of the century. So we expect the changes to get greater over time, but we also expect the changes to depend on something very important, which is our choices. Why? Because today, climate is not changing due to natural cycles or volcanoes or the sun. In fact, if it were changing due to those things, which have caused climate to change in the past, we would be getting cooler today, not warmer. Instead, we are getting warmer faster and faster, and there is only one reason that we're getting warmer, and that reason is us. Specifically, as we dig up and burn coal and gas and oil, it produces heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. That extra blanket is trapping the Earth's heat instead of allowing it to escape to space, just like an extra blanket traps your body heat on a cold night. And because we're wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it doesn't need, that's why the planet is heating up. And so as we look into the future, we can see that our choices matter. On the left-hand side, you see what's going to be happening if we reduce our carbon emissions and transition to clean energy. And on the right-hand side, you see what happens if we don't. We also are seeing changes in precipitation, and especially in the Midwest region, we've seen increases in winter and spring, which have been contributing to the increased risk of flooding in those seasons. And as you can see, as we head into the future, it's broken out here by season. As we head into the future, we expect to see continued increases specifically in winter and spring. Now, this is not so relevant to the Great Lakes, but it is still relevant to us because there's 700 million people around the world who live in low elevation coastal zones, and our economy is connected to what happens in the coastal zones. We are seeing sea level rise exponentially. What does that mean? It means it's accelerating. It's happening faster. Sea level is already rising twice as fast now as when the satellite observations began in the 1990s, and Greenland is melting 6 times faster than it was in the 1990s, and it's one of the main reasons why sea level is rising. All of that water has to go somewhere. But despite the importance of these long-term trends, the things that we are noticing most right now and that are causing the greatest economic damages are the impacts of climate change on our extremes. Now, let me be 100% clear here. We always have a chance of weather and climate extremes happening naturally, right? It's like we have a pair of weather dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double 6 naturally. Because of course, weather is natural. There's a reason they're called natural hazards, right? So we always have a chance of rolling a double 6 naturally. What is a double 6? A heat wave, a flood, a devastating hurricane, a storm, a drought, wildfires, and more. These are all part of life on this planet, and they happen naturally. So, okay, if they happen naturally, then what does climate change have to do with it? Here's what's happening. As climate changes decade by decade, it's as if it's sneaking in and taking one of the numbers on these dice and changing it into a 6 too. So all of a sudden we're rolling more and more 6s, like a baseball player on steroids. The baseball player could have hit a home run before, but all of a sudden he's hitting more home runs. And people are saying, why is he hitting more home runs? It's because something is loading the dice. And in the case of our weather extremes, it's climate change that's loading the dice against us. So instead of having, the very odd occasional 500-year flood, the city of Houston had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. That is not normal. And that's not all that's happening. In some cases, we're even seeing a few 7s show up on our dice. And we say, how could this happen? We've never seen anything like this before. That's how climate change is affecting us through our extremes. So let me get specific as to exactly what types of extremes are changing and how climate change is loading the dice against us. But I want to be 100% clear again. Climate change, 9 times out of 10, in fact, really 99 times out of 100, it's not creating something new that we've never seen before. It's taking something that we have seen before and making it worse. In fact, the single best description of climate change that I've ever heard comes from the US military. They call it a threat multiplier. And I think that really sums it up well. It's taking a threat that already exists and it's multiplying it or exacerbating it. So what type of threats is climate change multiplying and how is it doing it? Let me give you a few examples. First of all, we know that heavy rainfall, and I'm using the word precipitation here not to be all sciencey. I'm using it because sometimes precipitation falls as what? As snow, especially in the winter when it's cold enough, right? And even though the average temperature of the planet has been ticking up decade after decade, it's still cold enough to snow in the winter. So average precipitation has been increasing, and the Midwest and the Northeast are 2 of the places where it's increased the most. These are this plot shows what's already happened since the 1950s, a 42% increase in heavy precipitation across the whole Midwest. Now, how is this tied to a warming planet? Well, it's actually pretty direct. Warmer air holds more water vapor. So the warmer the air gets compared to how it used to be, even if it's below freezing, it's still warmer than it used to be, the more water vapor it can hold. And so when a storm comes along today, as opposed to 50 or 100 years ago, there's a lot more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there would have been 50 or 100 years ago. So our extreme precipitation is increasing. And I would just add here too, we are also seeing more days when Lake Erie isn't frozen. So it's below freezing, it's below 0 degrees Celsius or 32 Fahrenheit, but the lake isn't frozen because for the lake to be frozen, you need a deep freeze, not just a few days below freezing. So we have more days now where Lake Erie isn't frozen, but it's below freezing. And so that means that our lake effect snow is also increasing because lake effect snow happens when a cold air mass sweeps across an unfrozen lake, picks up all that water vapor and dumps it just on the other side. So we're also seeing an increase in lake effect snow. Why does this matter? It matters because it contributes both to increased lake effect snow, but also more importantly, to increased flood risk. And in the Midwest, one of the greatest ways that we are seeing climate change affect people in meaningful ways is by increasing this flood risk, which affects, of course, our infrastructure, our homes, our transportation, and our agriculture. And through that, of course, the economy. Again, floods are nothing new. We lived in Indiana for many years, and we had quite a few basement floods during that time. So it isn't that it's creating new floods, it's taking the heavy rain events that would have happened anyways and supersizing them, putting them on steroids, making them worse. So to be specific, the question here, and the question with any extreme event we see, is not did climate change cause this event? The question is, did climate change make it worse? And if so, by how much? Now, there's actually a research institute called the World Weather Attribution, where they study this specific question. Every time there's a new extreme event, they actually look at how much climate change made it worse. They looked at the Siberian heat wave where it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia, and they showed that it would be virtually impossible for that to happen without climate change. They looked at the extreme rainfall in Texas from Tropical Storm Imelda. They looked at the Australian bushfires, and they look at all of these specific events, and they're actually starting to be able to put some numbers on it. If you're interested in learning more about attribution, in addition to this website, there is a fantastic new book that came out. It's written by one of their scientists, actually, and it just came out 3 weeks ago, and it's called Angry Weather. So if you're interested, if you enjoy reading, take a quick snapshot of this, a screenshot or a picture with your phone, and get a copy of Angry Weather, because it explains in very simple terms. Don't worry, it's not a scientific textbook at all. It's a very personal narrative by Ferdy Otto, who's one of the scientists who does this, where she explains how they even got the idea to do this, how they do it, what they've found, and why it matters. It is fascinating reading at the very cutting edge of climate science, explaining the field of attribution, which is specifically how much worse did climate change make this specific event. But moving on, in addition to heavy precipitation, we can also look at things like sea level rise and how it's affecting people's homes. In Florida, in Miami, they're actually increasing the level of the streets by 2 feet, so they won't be underwater during high tide. Sea level rise has already sunk the Carolinas beachfront property values. Your Florida coastal home is already losing value, and in fact, they've showed that home sales in Florida in high-risk areas versus low-risk areas have already started to differ as early as 7 years ago. So as early as 7 years ago, you can actually see the signal in the home sales market in Florida of the impact of sea level rise on property values, which is kind of insane. What else is happening? Well, as the ocean gets warmer, it's affecting hurricanes. We are not seeing more hurricanes. The number goes up and down from year to year. We've had a lot this year, but not as many last year. But hurricanes are fueled by warm ocean water. And the warmer the ocean, the stronger the hurricanes. They intensify faster, they get bigger, they get stronger, and they have a lot more rain associated with them. And they're also slower. They sit over an area for longer. So Hurricane Harvey was one of the first events that happened 3 years ago. It was one of the first events where scientists were able to put a number on it. If you remember back to Hurricane Harvey, some places got as much as 50 inches of rain, which is insane when you think about it. And it turns out that it's likely that almost 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey was because of a warmer world. In other words, if you had the same hurricane 100 years ago, which you easily could have had, in fact, the 1900 Galveston hurricane, which hit almost the exact same area, was a very famous, very devastating and deadly hurricane. If you had the same hurricane back 100 years ago, you would have had 40% less rain. So you still would have had a lot of rain, right? You still would have had 30 inches in some places, but you wouldn't have had 50. And Hurricane Harvey is one of the most expensive events in U.S. history. And scientists went on to estimate just this past April that at least $67 billion of the damages during Hurricane Harvey were because it was supersized or amplified by a changing climate. That's how we can put the numbers on this. Now, headlines in recent weeks have been all about this. Wildfires, apocalyptic orange skies blanketing the west coast of the US, and some of that smoke even going over the border into Canada. Now, how do wildfires start? Are they started by climate change? No. Most wildfires in the lower 48 states are started by human ignition, not arson. Only 7% of the big wildfires in California are the result of deliberate ignition. Most of them are accidental. Like what? Like fireworks at a gender reveal party, Or like somebody having something plugged into their garage and it short-circuited and started a fire in the garage. Or like electrical wires from the power company sparking. Or like somebody dumping a load of burning trash into the dry brush. Yes, those are all real life examples I gave you. And those are all causes of the fires over the last few years. Now, what do fires start from up in Canada and Alaska? There, it's primarily lightning. So there's a little bit of a weather component to it too. But in general, we aren't seeing a greater number of wildfires, just like hurricanes. But you know what we are seeing? We are seeing those wildfires burn greater area. Why? Because the vegetation is much more dried out because in the Western US, it's been getting hotter and drier. So it's like, imagine if you drop a match into a pile of green wood, what happens? Not much. Then imagine you drop a match into a pile of bone dry kindling. What happens? A conflagration happens. That's climate change. Climate change is the difference between the green wood and the bone dry kindling. So this interesting graphic was produced by the California Fire Agency. What are you looking at here? You are looking at the 20 largest wildfires in California history. 3 out of those 20 fires happened before 2000. 3 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those, 5 out of the 20 happened in 2020. So what we're seeing is that we have about the same number of fires, but they're burning greater and greater and greater area. In fact, the August complex, look at the size of that pie piece. It is enormous. When we scientists look at this, this is exactly what we see in the data. So this figure only goes up to 2015. If it went up to 2020, you can guess what it would look like, I bet now. It only goes up to 2015, but it covers the whole Western US, and what we see is very clear. Without a changing climate, we would still have had about 11 million acres burned. That's the yellow area on the bottom, because wildfire is a natural part of the ecosystem, right? But with a changing climate, it has more than doubled the area burned by wildfire. That's how climate change is loading the dice against us. It's not just in the Western US. We are seeing this up in Alaska. They had their worst wildfire season on record last year. I know at this point last year seems like 10 years ago, but it was just last year. Canada is having devastating wildfires. And back in January, do you remember what the headlines were back in January this year? It wasn't coronavirus. It was this. Australia. They estimate 1 billion animals lost their lives, and some species might even be driven to extinction. So these extremes are all around us. They are symptoms of our wheels on the rumble strip as we navigate around a massive curve in our highway. And at this point, as the Prime Minister of Dominica said, he was his island was one of the islands that was devastated by the 2017 hurricane season, where they had a number of unusually strong hurricanes hit the Caribbean. He says, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. How serious is this? Well, you can see I like to read books. One of the books I've just been reading recently is an excellent book by a geologist. And she says very convincingly that the further back we go in the history of our Earth, the more and the better we understand how massive and how unprecedented the experiment is that we are conducting with the only home we have today. As she says, for example, we humans are now causing changes in our planet at the planetary scale that are faster, much faster, orders of magnitude faster in some cases, than natural geologic and biological processes. And in fact, the National Climate Assessment chapter, which I wrote, concludes that our carbon dioxide levels today, and what you're looking at here in the background is the ice core record of carbon dioxide, our carbon dioxide levels today are higher than they've been in 15 million years. Human civilization has been around for how long? 10,000 years? That's it. So we are well into uncharted territory, not for the planet itself, but for us humans. And that's why climate change matters. Continued growth in CO2 emissions over the century and beyond would lead to levels of atmospheric CO2 that we haven't seen in tens of millions of years. And in fact, when we look at how much coal and oil and gas we're digging up and burning, and how much carbon dioxide that's putting into the atmosphere, we can't find any analog for this speed of change as far back as we can go in the paleo record. And we can go back about 100 million years in terms of looking at short-term variations. We are conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only home that we have. So at this point, you might be wondering, why are we not treating this thing like a 5-alarm fire? Why are we not acting much more quickly to both prepare for that curve in the road and also to reduce our carbon emissions as fast as we can so the curve isn't as steep? Well, to that, we don't go to the physical science. For this, we have to go to the social science. And these are a set of very interesting maps that the Yale Program on Climate Communication has created. You can go ahead and look this up for Ohio. You can look it up for individual counties. You can see the counties on the map. You can also look it up for congressional districts, which is very interesting considering that an election is coming up. And what they do is they ask people a bunch of questions. So here they ask people, do you think global warming is happening? And if people said yes, if 50% of people in the county say yes, the county is orange. If less than 50% say yes, it's blue. And the darker orange or the darker blue, the more people say yes or the more people say no. So most people are on board with the idea that it's happening, 72%. Do you think that it will harm plants and animals? Yeah, people say yes, I think it will. Do you think it will harm future generations? Now, you might think this is the same map I just showed you, but it's not. It's a different question. And again, people say, yeah, it's real. It will harm plants and animals. It will harm future generations. Then they said, do you think it will harm people in developing countries? So not you here, but people in poor countries over there. And it's a little bit lower, 65%, but we're still largely orange. And then they said, do you think it will harm people in the United States? Lighter orange and some more blue. And you can see where we're going here. What are we doing? We're bringing it closer to home, right? We started off with plants and animals in the future and people far away. We're bringing it in. So then they ask one more question. This is the money question. Do you think it will harm you? All of a sudden, it is blue. It is blue across all of Ohio. It is blue across all of the Midwest, except the city of Chicago, where we did an impact study 10 years ago. So hopefully that made a difference. It is blue across almost the whole country, except for a few counties that have a lot of people from the most concerned people groups in the US about climate change, which are Hispanic, Catholics, and Native Americans. They are the two most concerned people groups. Why is that? I think it's because when somebody says global warming, what's the first thing you think of? A polar bear sitting on a piece of melting ice, which has nothing to do with our lives or the economy or our food or the places where we live. But as I hope you've seen, the reality is that the best image of how global warming affects us is this one. Who's on the melting iceberg here? It's us, humans. After the polar bear, we're next. Why? Because we've been driving down the road looking in the rear view mirror for 10,000 years. And now there's a curve coming up in the road, and our entire civilization is not prepared for that curve. Our building codes, our energy systems, our water distribution, our economy, our agriculture, our food, our health systems, our public services, our private sector, we are not prepared for that curve in the road because it is happening faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet. And in fact, probably faster than any time in the last 100 million years, as far as we can tell. All right, so at this point, I'm just gonna turn. I'm turning now and I'm going to say, what can we do? How can we prepare? We obviously have to cut our carbon emissions as fast and as soon as we can, but we can also adapt at the same time. It's not an either or. It's not a we do one but not the other. That ship has sailed. We have to do both. We have to mitigate and reduce our emissions. We have to adapt. But the good news is we already know a lot of what we need to adapt. Step one in building resilience to a changing climate is to say, well, what concerns do we already have? What are we already worried about? And we know what those are. For some places, it might be extreme heat. It might be air quality. It might be socioeconomic inequalities. It might be social justice issues. It might be flooding or lack of water or sea level rise or coastal storms. What concerns do we already have? And then step two is, how do those concerns connect to climate? Now, in some cases, all we need to know is the direction of the trend or even the fact that these risks exist. Let me give you an example. Moore, Oklahoma, they have had so many major tornadoes pass through. We're not quite sure how climate change is affecting tornadoes, although we do know that Tornado Alley is shifting northeast. Not great news for the Midwest and Ohio. Great news for Lubbock, Texas, which is no longer in Tornado Alley, if you can believe that. Tornado Alley is shifting northeast, but we can't say a lot more than that. But you already know if you're at risk for tornadoes, what you can do to adapt. For other purposes, though, we can use the direction of the trend. So we can say, we know that it's getting warmer, or that heavy rainfall is increasing, or that our risk of spring flooding is going up, or that the risk of algae blooms in Lake Erie is increasing. We can say we know the direction of the trend, and that's enough to build resilience. Let me give you another example. Extreme heat. You're worried about the impact of extreme heat in an urban center in the middle of a city on people's health. We can actually put numbers on that, and I'll show you a few numbers in a minute. But what are you going to do about it? If I tell you that your heat waves are going to become 3 times versus 4 times more frequent, are you going to do anything different with the information of 3 versus 4? No, because the response is the same. Heat watch warning systems, cooling centers, social networks to check on vulnerable people, waiving people's overdue power bills so they can keep the air conditioning on. All of those adaptation steps are the same without quantitative projections. All you need to know is, are things changing? And the answer is yes, and that's what you need to move ahead. But in some cases, quantitative projections can help. We don't want to waste too much money over preparing, but we don't want to under prepare either, because that will be more expensive. Let me give you an example here. The example here is stormwater. So say that your heavy rain and precipitation events are increasing. Your stormwater sewer system, like the one that we had where we lived in Indiana, is very old and cannot cope with the flow of water that it's getting these days, both possibly because of increased urbanization and runoff, as well as increased heavy precipitation. So you want to replace the storm sewers. Here's the thing. You don't want to put ones in that are way, way, way too big, bigger than you will ever need over the history of the storm sewer system, because that's going to cost more money than you need to spend now. But you definitely don't want to put in ones that are too small that will hold the current volume of water now, but in 20 years you have to dig them up and replace them. That's going to be way too expensive. So this is where quantitative projections can come in handy, and this is the type of thing that I often do when I work with cities. We develop quantitative projections that they can use as input to planning for flood and drought and extreme heat and other things like that. Because the fourth step here, so step 1, identify the problem. Step 2, connect it to climate trends. Step 3, figure out what information you need to plan. And then step 4 is the most important, which is respond proactively. Do something with the information. Build resilience today. A stitch in time saves 9. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. What our grandparents said was really accurate. So, for example, I mentioned that we worked with Chicago. We worked with 14 out of the 18 city departments who identified temperature or precipitation sensitive thresholds and used that to plan for what? For how often potholes would be forming in the city, for whether the rails on the metro system would be warping during extreme heat, for emergency situations in the south side of Chicago where the urban heat island effect is most acute. And they actually worked with a risk management firm to look at how much it would cost the city to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate, the further we go out into the future, and the greater or the lesser the amount of change that we see. They were able to put numbers on the benefits of adapting. And then they responded proactively. So, for example, one of the big concerns in Chicago that they identified was storm sewer overflow. And it was an especially big problem if it went into the lake, Lake Michigan, because Lake Michigan is part of the Great Lakes system, and it's governed by the Joint Commission between Canada and the US. So they were violating international pollution standards when the river would go into the lake as opposed to down back into the US like they reverse engineered it to many decades ago. So we looked specifically, for example, at the number of days where they would get more rain than the storm sewer system could handle. This was not a scientific threshold. It was a threshold dictated by the specific characteristics of the system in that city. And the fascinating thing is that a few years later, after we had done our study, I went back. In fact, it was about 5 or 6 years later. I just went back because I was curious. I was like, what's happening? What are they doing? And these are two of the headlines I found. New sewers quickly dispatch heavy rains, massive new reservoir to help alleviate Chicago area flooding. Now, these steps were not only because of the study we did for the city, it was also hastened along by farmers' insurance, who sued the city for failing to prepare for the impacts of a changing climate and leaving them and other insurance companies to foot the bill. Now, that I think was also part of the impetus towards this action, but they had the information they needed to respond proactively. We also looked at extreme heat in Chicago. We looked at the projected change in number of days per year over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and how that would affect their population. And we found a huge difference depending on what? Depending on the choices that we make with our carbon emissions. So this was also impetus for Chicago to say, we are going to take our leadership role as a city seriously. We are going to reduce our carbon emissions, which Columbus does, for example, too. They have a zero carbon goal by 2050, and a number of large cities around the world have implemented similar goals. Cities can really make a difference. It does not have to happen at the federal level. Cities can play a huge role, not just in adaptation, but in mitigation too. And though with adaptation, programs like green roofs and trees and things like that can make a huge difference as well. We are seeing the impact of this proactive response around the world. We are seeing cities take the lead in adaptation and mitigation because cities can act a little more nimbly than states or federal governments. Cities can make a difference with short-term benefits in the place where they live. So I am really encouraged by seeing what cities are doing and what cities are continuing to do with their 2050 carbon neutral goals, because they are leading the way to the future that we must have if we are to negotiate that curve. And as we do this, we can't neglect the fact that there's benefits to doing both. We can insulate to reduce the impact of extreme weather and cut our energy demand. We can install storage that builds resilience against power loss and extreme weather and adds stability to the renewable energy grid. We can improve our transportation options, which reduces carbon emissions and reduces infrastructure maintenance costs in a changing climate. There is so much that we can do. And all of this builds shared understanding and commitment between people, because the system is made up of people, and that's why individual actions matter. If you're not familiar with the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or CAKE, that's easy to remember, right? It's lunchtime, CAKE. CAKE has great examples of things that are happening around the US to prepare for and mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. But the bottom line is this: the way forward is not to just screech to a stop. No, we're driving down this road whether we like it or not. So we need to build our resilience to the risks we already know exist. We need to increase our resilience to the risks we know are getting stronger or more frequent. And we need to incorporate quantitative projections to prepare for the risks we know are going to intensify under greater change. And that is how we can continue down this road safely, rather than at the breakneck pace that's going to take us off the road if we continue on our current pathway. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Catherine. We are so grateful for your call to action and explaining it in a way that is so accessible. We're now going to get to the Q&A part of our series, and I know that there is a way for folks to submit questions using the app that Catherine talked about earlier. So if you see that app, if you're familiar with it, if not, it's still pretty easy. Ask your question by typing it in, and then if you see other people's questions, you can upvote them so that we try to get them answered. So make sure that you are able to get your questions in. The sooner the better, and let's come up with some great questions. But Catherine, thank you again for this, and we already have so many questions for you, and we appreciate your expertise and for you being with us here in Ohio and now through this session across Atlanta and Ohio today. So if it's all right, the first question I'll throw at you, and I think it's one that's on a lot of people's minds with the health pandemic that we're in right now. We've seen huge decreases in greenhouse gases back in March and April, in particular in our region. I know this is something folks have seen as shutdowns and other approaches across the pandemic have been used. Are there lessons, are there policies about what we saw with the health crisis that might apply here as we're talking about climate going forward?
Yes, there are so many parallels between what we have seen with coronavirus and what we see with climate change. Let me just walk through a few of them very quickly. First of all, the most obvious one is they both begin with C, and they're both a global challenge. But we also see that we have the same effect of psychological distance with the coronavirus. With climate change, we see it as a distant issue, and with coronavirus, we saw it as a distant issue until it was almost too late. But we saw with coronavirus that rapid action helped, but the action has to be sustained. It can't just be a knee-jerk reaction. We have to keep on going if we are going to beat this thing. And it's the same with climate change too. The good news is that the lockdown that we experienced in April around the world actually reduced our carbon emissions 17% for a single month. Now, of course, as soon as the lockdown ended, they just shot right back up again. But if those reductions had been permanent and sustainable, which they weren't, because shutting down the economy, shutting down schools, keeping everybody at home, that's not sustainable. If those reductions had been sustainable, though, the world would have been more than a third of the way to its 2030 Paris target in 1 month. A third of the way to the 2030 Paris carbon emissions target in 1 month. That is absolutely insane. So that shows us that our actions really can make a difference. Our choices really do matter. Yes, we need system-wide change to beat both coronavirus and climate change, but as individuals, what we do can make a difference. But there's one more sad parallel, actually two more sad parallels between climate change and coronavirus I want to bring up. One is that we see the exact same disinformation being created and circulated on coronavirus as we do in climate change. There are deliberate efforts to muddy the waters, to say, oh, it's not so bad, it's just a flu, the solutions are worse than the impacts, wearing a mask doesn't work anyways. We see the same bad actors as we do saying climate isn't changing, it's not real, those scientists are just making it up, and it's not so bad anyways. The exact same arguments are being used to our detriment. And then we also see that although both of them are a global challenge, although both of them are here and now and affecting every single one of us today already, they disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable people. And that is true right here in the US as well as around the world. So for example, air pollution. Air pollution in the United States is caused by burning fossil fuels, a little bit from wildfires, but mostly from fossil fuels. Air pollution is responsible for an average of 200,000 deaths in the US every year, most of them among people who are marginalized already, communities of color, people who can't afford to live somewhere else where they're not exposed to that air pollution. Now, of course, burning fossil fuels also produces the heat trapping gases that drive climate change. What's the connection to coronavirus? When our lungs are exposed to air pollution, it makes us more vulnerable. If we're exposed to the virus, we're more likely to get it. If we get it, we're more likely to get very sick and even die from it. So for example, in Chicago, 30% of the population in Chicago is African American. 70% of the COVID deaths are among the Black community. What's the connection? Air pollution. What's the source? Fossil fuels. So these global issues are intimately connected, and they teach us lessons about our vulnerability, but they also give us hope because they show us in real time that when we act, we can truly make a difference.
Thank you so much for that. And I know so much of our event over the last 2 days has been focused on bringing an equity lens when we think about climate and sustainability. And so that's particularly relevant as we think about how to move forward. We are seeing some really great questions come up on the chat. And the first one is about local governments. And MORPC, ARC, we both work with local governments of all sizes. So not just your Atlantas or your Columbuses, but we work with governments that are really small and are thinking about this and worried about this too. So what are the best approaches or tools that you might recommend to some of our smaller local governments as they think about climate?
That's a great question. And again, if you want to ask a question or upvote a question, which people have been doing, go to pollev.com/Katharine, my name, and you can see all the questions there. So for smaller cities, often, you don't have the resources where you can have a dedicated sustainability officer or an entire office, but there are great networks that already exist. There's the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, if you at least have one person who could join that. There's C40, and Mayor's Climate Alliance, and all kinds of other networks of people who might be one or two steps ahead down the path that you can call for advice. I don't know about you, but I've never met anybody at another city who I can call and say, hey, tell me about what you've been doing. And they would bend my ear for as long as I had, because talking about the challenges we face, the hurdles we've overcome, the goals we've set, the successes we've had, we really enjoy doing that. And so connecting with other people at other cities that are either at the same place as you and struggling with the same issues, or maybe just one step or two steps ahead down the path from you, I think is a tremendous resource. I also want to highlight one more thing, and that is that what I do and what my research has turned to in recent years is developing customized climate projections for weather stations in cities. So rather than getting these big maps like you see from the National Climate Assessment that show the whole country or that show a region, we're starting to develop projections specifically for the weather station at the airport, the weather station downtown, so that you can look at what days over 100 or 90 degrees look like in your city, what heavy rainfall looks like in your city, and how that's changing in the future. And I'm very excited, and this might be something for the future to come back to, I'm very excited that this coming year, we are going to be releasing our data set of climate projections for weather stations across the US with Esri. If you know Esri, it's a geographic information systems guru. They collect all kinds of data and make it available in ways that are easy for people to analyze. Our data set is going to be freely available because it was developed at our university. And that is going to be a fantastic one-stop shop for people to just go and pick up information. If you live in Bloomington or Springfield or Toledo or State College, you'll be able to just go and pick up the information for your local weather stations for both the observations, what's happened in the past, looking backwards in the rearview mirror, as well as for the future, the climate projections, and you'll be able to get a sense of what do I expect to see in the place where we live. So in the future, that'll be a resource that's coming up, and we're very excited about that because often most of the work I've done in the past has just been for the big cities that have the budget to do it. And I think this information should be available for everybody.
Katharine, you are speaking the language of, I know, MORPC's employees and ARC's employees, because we have mapping experts and planners. So many of our local planners are likely on the today's webinar too. So we're looking forward to that resource. Now, this next top question that we have from the audience is one that I'd be remiss to say thank you for mentioning weatherization and energy efficiency of homes. That's something that our organization does around Central Ohio. It's really important, simple way to help not just save money, but also help as a sustainability effort. So the question is, what do you recommend to help friends and family to do more to increase their climate literacy?
Well, let me back up just a minute and say this. Social science has found that the number one best person to have a conversation, to be a messenger about climate change, is not celebrities, they're number 10. Not religious leaders, they're number 7. Not healthcare professionals, they're number 4. Not scientists, we're number 2, so we're close to the top. But the number 1 most effective messenger to have this conversation is you. And what I mean by you is friends and family and people that you know, colleagues, business partners, neighbors, people you know. You're the most effective person to have that conversation with them, even more than me. Now, step 2, how do you have that conversation? Well, often we're tempted, especially when we see how scary this is, we're tempted to kind of throw the book at them and to be like, look, it's really bad and it's really scary and we should all be really worried about this. But again, what the social science has shown is talking about polar bears and ice sheets and sea level rise doesn't change people's minds. It just increases that sense of psychological distance we have of thinking that it's far away from us. And not only that, but climate change is the most politicized issue in the whole country. Number 3 is coronavirus, number 2 is race, and number 1 is climate change. So when we begin a conversation with something that we disagree with people on or with more scary facts, that often just leads people to shut off or tune out.
And then hit top
So
again.
how do we begin a positive, constructive conversation? Well, I actually have a whole TED Talk about that. So I'm not going to give you my TED Talk, though I'll pop it up on the screen here so you can see what it looks like. Just a second here. Here we go. Here's what my TED Talk looks like. I recommend giving it a watch. And in my TED Talk, I kind of lay out this approach of how do we talk about climate change productively? And the answer is we do it by beginning with something that we agree on, number 1, and then, oh, I'm sorry, it looks like something weird happened here. Here we go. Begin with something we agree on first. And one of the things we can agree on is what's happening where we live. Talk about what's happening in the place where we live, and then talk about positive, constructive solutions like efficiency, for example, like clean energy jobs, things that we can get on board with because they save us money, they grow the economy, they improve our air or water quality, and they do things that we can see that are good. So the most effective way we can have these conversations is by talking about why it matters to us in the places where we live, and that actually decreases our political polarization, studies have shown, and then talking about positive, constructive ways that we can fix it. So please do give my TED Talk a watch as it gets all into exactly that.
Great, and I think I speak for a lot of us that, yes, we've seen the TED Talk. It is an excellent resource. So this next question, I swear that I didn't enter it in. But you've got an event hosted by regional organizations. So the question is, what do you think regional organizations should do in addressing climate change?
Oh, well, I think first of all that everyone has a role in addressing climate change. We need the system to change, but the system is made up of people. So that is why I believe the number 1 thing that any of us as individuals can do is to use our voice to advocate for change at every level. And our organization is one of the first places that we can start. In our organization, first of all, we can build awareness so people understand how what we care about as an organization is being affected by a changing climate. And that's going to be different than a different organization. It's going to be different than the same organization in a different location. So step 1, identify how what you care about is being affected by climate change. Step 2, figure out what you can do about it most effectively, not just with long-term benefits, but with short-term benefits too. What are specific steps that you can take to build the resilience of your systems, to reduce the carbon footprint of your systems, and to use your collective voice as an organization to reach your next circle of influence outside? Those are the 3 critical steps that I believe an organization can do.
Well, that's really, really great. So, and this is something that I know our teams are spending a lot of time, our boards are thinking about, and so everybody can, but particularly regional organizations. So there's a couple of questions about how we can move forward when it's hard to notice. And you talked about climate being something that it's hard for humans to notice because we experience it over decades. Somebody actually phrased the question around the boiling frog theory, where the frogs don't notice that the water's heating up. What other advice would you give us on how to help people see and notice what's going on so that we don't end up as the boiled frogs to the question?
Absolutely. How can we show people the iceberg that we're sitting on and the pieces that are falling off the edge as we go along? So that's where the National Climate Assessment that I talked about is so helpful, because it has, again, a chapter for every region and it has a chapter for every sector. And it talks very explicitly about what is already happening. Not what's going to happen in the future, but what's already happening. And then it does talk about what's happening in the future and how people are going to respond to it. So in addition to that, though, I also have, if you don't want to read a big, giant scientific report, I have a YouTube series called Global Weirding. And some of you may be familiar with it. They're short videos, 6 or 7 minutes each. And we made one episode for every region of the US. So we have one episode on the Midwest, and we have one on the Northeast and the Southeast and so on and so forth. And in just a few minutes, it goes through what's happening, the kind of the highlights of what's happening where we live. So the most important thing to do is to learn about what's happening where you live, and what's happening where you live is different than where somebody else lives. Because climate change is loading the dice against us. So whatever causes your double sixes is what's being exacerbated. Wildfire in the Western US, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, flooding in the Midwest, also extreme heat, greater humidity, again, algae blooms. There's also increased risk of invasive species, right? You know, the deer ticks that carry Lyme disease are all the way up through Minnesota now, and they used to be a thing that were only a thing in the South. All kinds of pests that are attacking crops, changing growing periods, decreasing crop productivity. All of these things are changing. So find out what's happening in the places where you live. National Climate Assessment and our Global Weirding videos are great places to start. And then when you have conversations with people, then you can kind of start with, hey, how long have you lived here? Have you noticed this has been happening? And that's a great place to kickstart the conversation. In fact, I don't know if you've heard of something called the warming stripes. It was created by another climate scientist called Ed Hawkins over in the UK. And it's really simple. It's just a bar with one line for every year. And if it's warmer than average, it's red. If it's cooler than average, it's blue. If it's average, it's white. And then obviously the redder it is, the warmer it is. And what you see is you see where you live progressing in time. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you if you don't mind, because this is a really cool thing to see if you don't know about it. And let's see if I can find it first of all. Here we go. Let's see, Google warming stripes, and you can Google this yourself if you're on your own computer. Oh, here we go. It's showyourstripes.info is the website that Ed has created. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. So these are what the global warming stripes look like here. But if you drill down, you can go to North America, and then you can go to the United States, and then you can go to Ohio and get the warming stripes for Ohio. And here's the warming stripes for Ohio. You see that? And what is so interesting is that people have actually made flip-flops and dresses and leggings and ties and knitting patterns and crochet patterns and blankets. They've made things out of the warming stripes. What a great conversation starter that is, don't you think?
That's really fun. That's really fun. We're going to have to look at that and maybe contemplate some MORPC apparel with that for Ohio as a way to have a call to action. So we've just got a couple more minutes left, and we've got some more questions for you, Katharine. So thanks so much again for spending time with us today. You talked a little bit about this earlier, but I know we've got some questions where folks are really concerned about equity and vulnerable communities. And when we think about extreme weather, there's so much more impact on communities without resources or communities of color sometimes. What else do you think we should think about when we're thinking about equity in climate preparedness?
Mm-hmm. Well, to be totally honest, I wouldn't say sometimes, I would say the vast majority of the time. Those who are already, who already have the short end of the stick, who are already marginalized or disadvantaged, are typically the ones who are most affected by these changes, again, right here at home as well as on the other side of the world. So here's the challenge often that we see in those communities is you come along and you say, hey, climate change is affecting you. And everybody's like, oh, add number 258 to my list of things that I need to worry about. If I can't feed my family, if I have mold in the basement, if my kids aren't even getting to school, if there's violence, if I can't even pay my air conditioning bill, if I got thrown out of work by COVID, why should I worry about climate change? That, I think, is one of the biggest challenges we have. And to address that, we need to just look at it from a different perspective. Have you ever looked at something and then you just rotate 90 degrees and you look at it from a different angle and it looks completely different? Here's the different angle with climate change. The only reason we care about it is because it affects our health, our food, our safety, the future of our kids, the condition of our home, the economy, our jobs. That's the only reason we care about climate change. Remember, it's a threat multiplier, as I said. So rather than saying climate change is something that we have to shoehorn into our already overcrowded list of priorities and somehow make it go a few more up, I don't think climate change needs to be on anybody's priority list at all, because the only reason we care about it is because of what is already at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on our pre-existing priority list. Another way to think about it is like we have a bucket and we're trying to fill this bucket, but there's a hole in the bottom and the hole is climate change. So because I care about poverty, I care about climate change. Because I care about injustice, I care about climate change. Because I care about the health issues in urban centers, I care about climate change. And we have to, if we leave climate change until we've fixed these other issues, it's going to be too late because we can never fix them without fixing climate change. So that's why, as I touched on very lightly, that's why it's so important to identify concrete, positive, constructive steps we can take. Actions, changes, policies, awareness, things that have short-term benefits, immediate benefits, helping with issues of socioeconomic injustice or health or inequity, but that also take us along the road towards reducing our carbon emissions and or building resilience to the impacts of a changing climate. It is more important than ever to apply that extra climate lens to all of the actions and choices we make, because otherwise everything we do today is not going to be, it's not going to achieve the result that we want to, because climate change is the great threat multiplier.
So the last question we have for you is a personal one. So I know so many of us think about climate change. We work on this, we spend our careers on it, we care about equity and poverty and those other things. It can get really overwhelming and hard to stay positive. And I think so many people look to you because you bring this positive energy to it, this strength of we can tackle this. And the question is, how do you not get overwhelmed with this? How do you keep focused on staying positive and working towards change?
Well, it is overwhelming, and everybody who works in a field where you see so much wrong, whether you're working with issues of socioeconomic inequality, racial justice, kids' health, or climate change, when you see so much that's wrong, it's hard not to be overwhelmed. And so what I do is I actually practice hope. And when I say I practice, I mean like practice the piano. You do it and you keep doing it and you try to get better at it. Because in order to continue, we have to recognize that a better future is possible. It's not ensured, it's not going to happen for sure. It only will happen if we continue our forward momentum. And so what I do specifically is I go out and I look for examples of people or places or corporations or cities or organizations that are making a difference, that are doing something. Even just seeing one person or hearing about one person doing something, like the fact that here in where I live, in the second most conservative city in the US, a team of 6th graders won a national science competition this summer for a project called Carbon Keepers, about how we can put carbon back in the soil through smart agriculture techniques. Project Drawdown has a list of over 100 really inspirational solutions. There's all kinds of great TED Talks about what's happening in Bhutan and even China in unexpected places in the world with clean energy, with smart carbon farming, with all kinds of other things like that. So whenever you feel depressed and discouraged, which believe me, I do too, that's kind of a signal to stop. Take some time for yourself, do the things that remind you of why you're fighting for this incredible world that we live in, and go out and actually look for one or more examples of people who are making a difference. So we realize and we remind ourselves again, and I have to do this almost daily, that this issue is not a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of the hill with only my hands on it trying to roll it up the hill. No, that boulder is already at the top of the hill. It's already starting to roll down the hill in the right direction, very, very, very slowly. That boulder already has millions of hands on it. And reminding ourselves, sort of taking a pause, right? So taking our hands off the boulder for a little bit, taking a drink of water, doing a few stretches, relaxing, looking to the left and the right to see who's there with us. That's something that we all need to practice. Take that break, restore yourself, and then put your hands back on that boulder and give it an even stronger shove than we did before.
Wow, thank you for that. I think I speak for so many of us watching today that we're inspired, our hands are on that boulder, and we just appreciate you so much, Dr. Hayhoe. I know that we have people virtually applauding at home, so thank you again, and we appreciate you. We've had so many great speakers and panelists throughout this summit, and we'd like to conclude today. And as we conclude, I have two challenges for you as we go forward. First, we know you're with us in working on sustainability if you've been watching. If you are, I challenge you to strengthen your communities, your homes, your workplace by having a willingness to be a leader on these issues, to inspire others and make sure that everyone is included. If you're not involved, it won't get done. And if you care about it, you got to get involved. The second challenge I have for you, that's why you have organizations like the Atlanta Regional Commission and the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. We can help. We're a resource and a service to you. If you live in our areas, or even if you don't, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or my team. We thrive on those calls and requests and creative challenges, and we need your involvement and support to do our work so that we can help get ahead of growth and change and stay leaders in sustainability. So with that, I'd like to turn it over for some closing thoughts to our friend and leader in Atlanta, Doug.
Thank you, William. I just wanted to say to William and Amanda and the whole MORPC team, thank you once again for inviting us to be your partners in presenting this year's Sustainability Summit. It was an excellent effort. Dr. Hayhoe was just incredible. I was hanging on every word, every slide she had, every thought. And what a great way to close out a momentous, thoughtful, informative, and challenging summit on sustainability and the things that all of us can do to be engaged and to help further our communities in a great way. So again, thank you for inviting us to be part of it. It's always fun to be with you, my friend. And of course, the folks at ARC in the Atlanta region are just a call or a Zoom conference away to join you again on other kinds of things. And I hope everybody out there from the Atlanta side of things, both in the audience and in the ARC staff, enjoyed this joint conference as well as I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and we appreciate you, my friend, for being engaged in your team. We do this every year. This was the only time we've done it in a virtual format. God willing, we might do it in person next year, but if not, I think this worked pretty well. We hope to hear from you soon. We are thinking of you and keeping everyone in our thoughts as we tackle this health crisis and as we work on the issues that we care about. This concludes the conference. Be well.